What if the person who stood to inherit tens of millions from the people who loved him most was also accused of taking their lives? Imagine the unimaginable: a family of Hollywood royalty, a father whose name commands respect across generations of actors, directors, and storytellers, and a mother whose elegance and intelligence matched the industry's brightest stars, both suddenly gone. And at the center of the storm, a son. The very son who should have been the heir to their legacy now faces the unimaginable: a murder charge so severe, so horrifying, that it shakes not only the family but the entire public consciousness. That son is Nick Reiner, and the lives of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner are forever etched into history by both their brilliance and the tragedy that would unfold in the quiet spaces of their home. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins not with scandal, not with accusations, but with a room filled with palpable tension. The kind of tension that makes you hold your breath and wait for something to snap. Billy Crystal, a longtime friend of Rob Reiner, steps into the dimly lit living room of the Reiner household, a folder clutched in his hands, the weight of expectation pressing down on everyone present. A will is about to be read. Not just any will. The last testament of a man whose influence shaped generations of Hollywood legends. And yet, in this moment, the story is not about money. It is about legacy, betrayal, grief, and the impossible moral questions that arise when the person you trusted most is accused of an act that defies human comprehension. The family is seated around the room. Eyes flick from one face to another. Jake, the eldest, 34, struggles to mask the anger and sorrow swirling inside him. Romy, the youngest, 27, sits stiffly, clutching a pillow, trying to contain the shock that keeps threatening to spill over. Tracy, from Rob's first marriage, sits quietly, her face a careful mask, though her eyes betray a mixture of grief, fear, and confusion. And then there is Nick, 32, a man who once walked freely among his siblings, now in the shadow of suspicion. His future is uncertain as the fate of the inheritance itself. Every heartbeat in the room seems to echo like a drum, counting down to the moment when the contents of the will be revealed, when decisions that could shape lives are made in the span of a few sentences. To understand the gravity of the situation, we must step back and consider the family at the center of this storm. Rob Reiner was more than an actor, more than a director. He was a visionary whose career spanned decades, whose influence reached across generations of Hollywood professionals. His films were not just entertainment. They were cultural landmarks, reflections of society's hopes, fears, and contradictions. Michelle Singer Reiner, by his side, was the quiet yet formidable anchor. Her support and intellect were a constant presence, a guiding hand for their children, and an equal partner in shaping a life filled with both accomplishment and compassion. Together, they represented the ideal of a Hollywood family, successful, admired, and seemingly untouchable. Yet behind the polished veneer of red carpet appearances, award ceremonies, and public acclaim, every family harbors complexities. The Reiners were no different. Sibling rivalries, unspoken grievances, and subtle tensions often simmered beneath the surface. Nick, the middle child, had his own struggles. Ambitions, frustrations, and the weight of expectations that come with growing up in a family whose name carries immense weight. In the wake of tragedy, these undercurrents erupted, revealing layers of emotion and conflict that few outside the family could fully grasp. The night of the murders was one of those moments that would redefine the family's story forever. Rob and Michelle were found dead in their Los Angeles home, victims of multiple sharp force injuries, a horror that shook even the most seasoned investigators. The news hit the public with a shockwave of disbelief. Hollywood, a world accustomed to drama on screens and in tabloids, was suddenly confronted with a real-life tragedy that defied understanding. And at the center of this nightmare was a name that no one could reconcile with the crime: Nick Reiner. Authorities moved swiftly, charging Nick with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The very son who should have been mourning alongside his siblings now faced the grim possibility of life in prison without parole, or even the death penalty. Questions swirled. How could this happen? What drove someone to commit such an act? And, perhaps most controversially, Could Nick Reiner still claim any part of the inheritance that he was poised to receive? This question introduces us to a critical aspect of the story, the Slayer statute. Under this legal principle, anyone convicted of murdering a person whose estate they would inherit is barred from receiving a single penny. It's a law designed to prevent perpetrators from benefiting from their crimes, a moral and legal safeguard that comes into stark relief in situations like the Reiner tragedy. But the application of this statute is far from simple. It involves trusts, wills, and the judgment of trustees who must navigate both legal obligations and moral responsibilities. In the Reiners case, the estate and trust were complex, reflecting decades of careful planning and a desire to protect the family's wealth and legacy. Estate and trust attorney Sean Weisbart, who is not connected to the Reiner case, explains that trustees have broad powers to manage such situations. They can include siblings, close family confidants, or lawyers tasked with interpreting the intentions of the deceased. Look, Nick Reiner is accused of a very, very serious crime that would clearly deprive him of his inheritance, Weisbart said. I'm not going to take any chances and give him any money. The weight of that statement is heavy with implication. The family must decide not just how to distribute wealth, but how to reconcile love, loyalty, and the consequences of unimaginable actions. Amidst this legal and moral turmoil, Nick Reiner has secured high-profile representation. Alan Jackson, a well-known defense attorney, has been hired to navigate the treacherous waters of criminal law and estate implications. Yet even the best legal strategy cannot erase the emotional scars or the public scrutiny that accompanies a case of this magnitude. Nick remains behind bars, awaiting his arraignment, his life suspended in a state of uncertainty, while his siblings, friends, and the broader community grapple with the shock, grief, and questions that refuse to be answered easily. This is not a story that can be told with simple facts or dry recitations of legal statutes. It is a story of power and vulnerability, of wealth and morality, of trust shattered and family bonds tested to their breaking point. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about ambition, and about the fragility of life itself. As we peel back the layers of this narrative, chapter by chapter, we will uncover revelations that are both shocking and deeply human. We will examine the intricacies of inheritance law, the psychological toll of public scandal, and the ethical dilemmas that arise when the people we love are accused of the unthinkable. And yet, even as we prepare to dive into the details, one question looms over every revelation, every legal maneuver, and every family conversation. Will Nick Reiner ever inherit a single cent of his parents' fortune? Or has the combination of tragedy, law, and moral outrage sealed his fate forever? What does it mean to be Hollywood royalty? Is it simply fame, wealth, or a name that echoes through awards shows and glossy magazine covers? For Rob Reiner, it was all that, and more. From the moment he first stepped into the spotlight, Reiner's career was a masterclass in navigating Hollywood with talent, charisma, and an uncanny ability to connect with audiences. But behind the accolades and the applause lay the story of a man who built an empire not just of films, but of family, legacy, and influence that would span generations. Rob Reiner was born into the Reiner family as the son of Carl Reiner, a towering figure in comedy and television, and Estelle Reiner, an elegant matriarch whose presence commanded quiet respect. Growing up in Los Angeles, Rob was immersed in the entertainment world from the start. He witnessed the magic of storytelling firsthand, learned the intricacies of performance, and absorbed the lessons of fame and responsibility from his parents. But unlike many children of famous parents, he carved his own path. Acting in All in the Family catapulted him into stardom, but it was his transition into directing that cemented his reputation as a creative force. The 1980s and 1990s saw Rob Reiner at the peak of his powers. Films like This Is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, and When Harry Met Sally weren't just box office successes, they were cultural touchstones. Each project showcased a keen understanding of human emotion, humor, and the stories that bind us together. Colleagues spoke of his intensity on set, balanced by a warmth that made actors and crew feel part of a larger family. In Hollywood, where alliances shift and egos collide, Reiner earned respect not by intimidation, but through a combination of vision, loyalty, and charm. And yet, behind the cameras, his greatest role was as a husband and father. Michelle Singer, who became Michelle Reiner after their marriage, was a force in her own right. Known for her intelligence, grace, and unwavering support of Rob, she complemented his larger-than-life persona with a grounded presence that kept the family centered. Friends described Michelle as someone who quietly influenced everyone around her, from philanthropic projects to family decisions, ensuring that their home was not only a sanctuary, but a place where values and love were prioritized above all else. Together, Rob and Michelle embodied a Hollywood ideal: success without arrogance, fame without losing oneself, influence without exploiting others. They cultivated an environment in which their children, Jake, Nick, Romy, and Tracy, could grow, explore their own ambitions, and feel the stability that many children of celebrities rarely experience. There was laughter in the hallways, heated debates over trivial family matters, but also a deep, unspoken understanding that family came first, no matter what the public saw. Yet, as in any family, the surface beauty hid complexities. Siblings have rivalries, and the Reiners were no exception. Jake, the eldest, carried the weight of responsibility, feeling pressure to live up to the family name while carving out his own identity. Nick, the middle child, was known for his charm but also for restless energy, sometimes clashing with his parents' high expectations. Romy, the youngest, had her own quiet intensity, observing and navigating family dynamics with caution. And Tracy, from Rob's first marriage to the late Penny Marshall, brought a layer of history and emotional nuance to the family tapestry, with relationships that were strong yet subtly complicated. The Reiners' public image suggested perfection, but anyone familiar with family life knows that perfection is always an illusion. Underneath the accolades, the awards, and the Hollywood glamour, there were unspoken tensions, moments of jealousy, disagreements over inheritance, and the occasional argument that hinted at deeper undercurrents. These tensions would later become magnified under the weight of tragedy, revealing cracks in the family's foundation that were previously invisible. Hollywood itself played a role in shaping the Reiners' narrative. Fame has a way of amplifying both joy and tragedy, turning private moments into public spectacle. Rob's career afforded him access to the elite, friendships with other luminaries, and opportunities that many could only dream of. But it also brought scrutiny, expectation, and a relentless pressure to maintain a facade of success. Michelle, ever the partner, navigated these pressures with grace, ensuring that their children understood that the value of a life was not measured by wealth or recognition, but by character, compassion, and resilience. The family's wealth, while significant, was not simply inherited or casually managed. Decades of careful planning went into their estates, trusts, and financial arrangements. Every decision reflected a desire to provide for their children while safeguarding their legacy. It was a legacy rooted in the belief that family should endure beyond the fame, that love and responsibility were worth more than accolades or money. Yet, as history would reveal, even the most carefully constructed legacies are vulnerable to human frailty and unforeseen tragedy. At the heart of the Reiner story is the paradox of visibility. They were celebrated publicly, admired for their accomplishments, yet intimately vulnerable in ways that the public could not see. Fame cannot protect a family from grief, legal complexities, or the dark potential that lies within human relationships. Rob and Michelle's lives, filled with laughter, creativity, and love, would ultimately intersect with tragedy, setting the stage for questions about morality, inheritance, and justice that would grip the world's attention. And then came the moment that no one could prepare for, the night that would forever alter the Reiners' story. It was a night that would challenge every assumption about family, wealth, and trust. It was a night when the golden veneer of Hollywood royalty would be scratched away, revealing tensions, suspicions, and moral dilemmas that even the most skilled lawyer or counselor could barely navigate. In the quiet of their Los Angeles home, a tragedy unfolded that would leave the world asking how such a thing could happen, and whether the very fabric of family loyalty could survive the unthinkable. What would come next was not just a story about wealth or fame, but about consequences, about the fragility of trust, the complexity of legal and moral obligations, and the ways in which the actions of one person could ripple outward to touch the lives of everyone connected. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer-Reiner had built a life of influence and love, but the forces unleashed by that night would test the very foundations of their family. And just as the public began to grasp the magnitude of the tragedy, the question that would haunt every sibling, friend, and observer came into sharp focus. With Nick Reiner accused of his parents' murders, what would happen to the inheritance, the family legacy, and the moral compass that guided the Reiners' lives? The answers were not simple, and the implications would reverberate through courtrooms, family meetings, and public discourse for years to come. Even in the most outwardly perfect families, tension simmers beneath the surface, invisible to the casual observer. The Reiners were no exception. To the world, they were a Hollywood dynasty, accomplished, admired, and seemingly unshakable. But behind closed doors, the dynamics among siblings, parents, and extended family carried complexities that few outsiders could fully grasp. These were the threads that, when pulled, would unravel into the tragic drama the world would come to know. Jake Reiner, the eldest of Rob and Michelle's children, bore a responsibility that often went unspoken. At 34, he had grown up with the awareness that as the firstborn, expectations rested heavily on his shoulders. He was the one to set an example, to uphold the family name, and to be a stabilizing force among siblings. Friends describe him as diligent and principled, someone who internalized pressure and rarely displayed the storm of emotions that roiled inside. Yet that very restraint sometimes left him feeling isolated, a spectator to the more volatile dynamics around him. Nick Reiner, the middle child, was a different story entirely. Charismatic and intelligent, he had the presence to command attention, yet beneath the charm lay a restless energy. Nick often clashed with his parents' expectations and occasionally with his siblings. While not overtly rebellious, his ambition and impatience sometimes created friction. In many ways, Nick carried a paradox, the heir to a vast fortune, yet a man whose impulses could outpace judgment. Family friends noted that Nick craved recognition, not just as Rob Reiner's son, but as someone who could make his own mark in the world. Yet those ambitions, when combined with underlying tensions, set the stage for conflicts that were both personal and financial. Romy, the youngest, observed everything with a quiet, calculating awareness. At 27, she had the clarity to see patterns others missed. Romy understood the tensions between Jake and Nick, recognized the subtle favoritism that could creep into family decisions, and navigated these dynamics with caution. Unlike her older siblings, she was less driven by competition and more by the desire to maintain stability, though the stress of living in a family under scrutiny weighed heavily. Her role was often that of the mediator, a position that required emotional intelligence far beyond her years. Tracy Reiner, from Rob's first marriage to Penny Marshall, added another layer of complexity. Her relationship with her father and half-siblings was deep but nuanced. She shared the familial love and loyalty that bound the Reiners, yet her presence also reminded the younger siblings that family structures are never as simple as they appear. Tracy's connection to Rob was historically strong, built on years of trust and shared experience. Yet the sudden tragedy would force her to navigate the emotional minefield of grief, legal implications, and family loyalty in ways that no one could have anticipated. The parents themselves, Rob and Michelle, were acutely aware of these tensions, even if they hoped their love and guidance would smooth the edges. They had always strived to treat their children equitably, but human nature and circumstance often complicate intentions. Decisions about inheritance, responsibilities, and expectations, though carefully considered, could unintentionally fuel rivalries. These dynamics were subtle, often invisible to the outside world, but they created an emotional landscape where small disagreements could escalate into profound conflicts. Even within a family as prominent as the Reiners, ordinary human issues, jealousy, rivalry, resentment, and miscommunication persisted. Nick sometimes felt overshadowed by Jake's steadiness and Romy's perceptiveness, while Jake could feel frustration at Nick's impulsive tendencies. Romy, striving to maintain harmony, occasionally found herself caught in the crossfire, forced to navigate loyalties that were at times contradictory. And Tracy, balancing her own grief and love for her father, often found herself observing from the periphery, quietly assessing the evolving dynamics. The Reiners' wealth and fame amplified these tensions. In most families, disagreements over responsibilities or expectations might be contained behind closed doors. For the Reiners, however, the stakes were far higher. Every action, every decision, carried the weight of legacy, public perception, and financial consequence. The combination of high expectations, intense scrutiny, and deeply personal emotions created an environment where even minor disputes could escalate into crises. Hollywood itself played a role in shaping the Reiners' narrative. Fame has a way of amplifying both joy and tragedy, turning private moments into public spectacle. Rob's career afforded him access to the elite, friendships with other luminaries, and opportunities that many could only dream of. But it also brought scrutiny, expectation, and a relentless pressure to maintain a facade of success. Michelle, ever the partner, navigated these pressures with grace, ensuring that their children understood that the value of a life was not measured by wealth or recognition, but by character, compassion, and resilience. The family's wealth, while significant, was not simply inherited or casually managed. Decades of careful planning went into their estates, trusts, and financial arrangements. Every decision reflected a desire to provide for their children while safeguarding their legacy. It was a legacy rooted in the belief that family should endure beyond the fame, that love and responsibility were worth more than accolades or money. Yet, as history would reveal, even the most carefully constructed legacies are vulnerable to human frailty and unforeseen tragedy. At the heart of the Reiner story is the paradox of visibility. They were celebrated publicly, admired for their accomplishments, yet intimately vulnerable in ways that the public could not see. Fame cannot protect a family from grief, legal complexities, or the dark potential that lies within human relationships. Rob and Michelle's lives, filled with laughter, creativity, and love, would ultimately intersect with tragedy, setting the stage for questions about morality, inheritance, and justice that would grip the world's attention. And then came the moment that no one could prepare for, the night that would forever alter the Reiners' story. It was a night that would challenge every assumption about family, wealth, and trust. It was a night when the golden veneer of Hollywood royalty would be scratched away, revealing tensions, suspicions, and moral dilemmas that even the most skilled lawyer or counselor could barely navigate. In the quiet of their Los Angeles home, a tragedy unfolded that would leave the world asking how such a thing could happen, and whether the very fabric of family loyalty could survive the unthinkable. What would come next was not just a story about wealth or fame, but about consequences, about the fragility of trust, the complexity of legal and moral obligations, and the ways in which the actions of one person could ripple outward to touch the lives of everyone connected. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner had built a life of influence and love, but the forces unleashed by that night would test the very foundations of their family. And just as the public began to grasp the magnitude of the tragedy, the question that would haunt every sibling, friend, and observer came into sharp focus. With Nick Reiner accused of his parents' murders, what would happen to the inheritance, the family legacy, and the moral compass that guided the Reiners' lives? The answers were not simple, and the implications would reverberate through courtrooms, family meetings, and public discourse for years to come. Even in the most outwardly perfect families, tension simmers beneath the surface, invisible to the casual observer. The Reiners were no exception. To the world, they were a Hollywood dynasty, accomplished, admired, and seemingly unshakable. But behind closed doors, the dynamics among siblings, parents, and extended family carried complexities that few outsiders could fully grasp. These were the threads that, when pulled, would unravel into the tragic drama the world would come to know. Jake Reiner, the eldest of Rob and Michelle's children, bore a responsibility that often went unspoken. At 34, he had grown up with the awareness that as the firstborn, expectations rested heavily on his shoulders. He was the one to set an example, to uphold the family name, and to be a stabilizing force among siblings. Friends describe him as diligent and principled, someone who internalized pressure and rarely displayed the storm of emotions that roiled inside. Yet that very restraint sometimes left him feeling isolated, a spectator to the more volatile dynamics around him. Nick Reiner, the middle child, was a different story entirely. Charismatic and intelligent, he had the presence to command attention, yet beneath the charm lay a restless energy. Nick often clashed with his parents' expectations and occasionally with his siblings. While not overtly rebellious, his ambition and impatience sometimes created friction. In many ways, Nick carried a paradox, the heir to a vast fortune, yet a man whose impulses could outpace judgment. Family friends noted that Nick craved recognition, not just as Rob Reiner's son, but as someone who could make his own mark in the world. Yet those ambitions, when combined with underlying tensions, set the stage for conflicts that were both personal and financial. Romy, the youngest, observed everything with a quiet, calculating awareness. At 27, she had the clarity to see patterns others missed. Romy understood the tensions between Jake and Nick, recognized the subtle favoritism that could creep into family decisions, and navigated these dynamics with caution. Unlike her older siblings, she was less driven by competition and more by the desire to maintain stability, though the stress of living in a family under scrutiny weighed heavily. Her role was often that of the mediator, a position that required emotional intelligence far beyond her years. Tracy Reiner, from Rob's first marriage to Penny Marshall, added another layer of complexity. Her relationship with her father and half-siblings was deep but nuanced. She shared the familial love and loyalty that bound the Reiners, yet her presence also reminded the younger siblings that family structures are never as simple as they appear. Tracy's connection to Rob was historically strong, built on years of trust and shared experience. Yet the sudden tragedy would force her to navigate the emotional minefield of grief, legal implications, and family loyalty in ways that no one could have anticipated. The parents themselves, Rob and Michelle, were acutely aware of these tensions, even if they hoped their love and guidance would smooth the edges. They had always strived to treat their children equitably, but human nature and circumstance often complicate intentions. Decisions about inheritance, responsibilities, and expectations, though carefully considered, could unintentionally fuel rivalries. These dynamics were subtle, often invisible to the outside world, but they created an emotional landscape where small disagreements could escalate into profound conflicts. Even within a family as prominent as the Reiners, ordinary human issues, jealousy, rivalry, resentment, and miscommunication persisted. Nick sometimes felt overshadowed by Jake's steadiness and Romy's perceptiveness, while Jake could feel frustration at Nick's impulsive tendencies. Romy, striving to maintain harmony, occasionally found herself caught in the crossfire, forced to navigate loyalties that were at times contradictory. And Tracy, balancing her own grief and love for her father, often found herself observing from the periphery, quietly assessing the evolving dynamics. The Reiners' wealth and fame amplified these tensions. In most families, disagreements over responsibilities or expectations might be contained behind closed doors. For the Reiners, however, the stakes were far higher. Every action, every decision, carried the weight of legacy, public perception, and financial consequence. The combination of high expectations, intense scrutiny, and deeply personal emotions created an environment where even minor disputes could escalate into crises. There were also unspoken questions about the future. The family's fortune, while substantial, had always been accompanied by the weight of responsibility. How would the estate be managed? Who would serve as trustee? What would happen if tragedy struck, as it ultimately did? These were considerations that, prior to the events that would shake their world, existed as theoretical possibilities. Yet, in retrospect, they were foreshadowing the very challenges that the Reiners would confront in the wake of their parents' deaths. Even the siblings' relationships with each other were complicated by the presence of trust, inheritance, and perceived favoritism. Nick, as the middle child, sometimes wrestled with feelings of being both central and peripheral. Jake, as the eldest, carried the dual burden of leadership and scrutiny. Romy sought to mediate, often at the expense of her own emotional needs. Tracy navigated her dual identity as both insider and outsider, managing relationships with both her father and half-siblings. These dynamics were subtle yet potent, creating a web of interactions that, under stress, could produce unpredictable outcomes. As with many families, love and conflict existed side by side, inseparable and intertwined. The Reiners exemplified this paradox, a family capable of deep loyalty and extraordinary achievements, yet vulnerable to the pressures and complexities that accompany human relationships. It was within this tension that the seeds of the future tragedy were sown, though no one at the time could have imagined the full scope of what was to come. When tragedy struck, these dynamics would come to the forefront in ways that were unavoidable. Grief and suspicion are powerful forces, capable of magnifying both strengths and weaknesses. The Reiners' story, already layered with the complexities of fame, wealth, and family, would now intersect with law, morality, and public scrutiny. The relationships that once defined them privately would become public narratives, dissected and analyzed by both media and the courts. And yet, the emotional and psychological weight of these family tensions is not just about interpersonal conflict. It's about context, about environment, about how people respond when the unthinkable happens. In the Reiners' case, the night that would change everything forced each sibling to confront questions of trust, loyalty, and survival. Who could be relied upon? Who could be forgiven? And who, ultimately, could claim what they believed was rightfully theirs? This was more than a family in crisis. It was a study in human psychology under pressure. The very qualities that once made the Reiners a successful, admired family, ambition, loyalty, intelligence, and love, would now become both their armor and their vulnerability. Each sibling faced a test that would challenge not only their relationships with one another, but their understanding of morality, justice, and family legacy itself. And as the public began to catch glimpses of the tragedy, speculation about the relationships, loyalties, and secrets of the Reiners intensified. Each revelation, subtle or overt, added tension, as everyone struggled to piece together a narrative that made sense. But no matter how much outsiders analyzed, the most consequential truths remained hidden in private moments, unspoken words, and the silent observations of siblings navigating grief and suspicion. What would come next would turn these subtle undercurrents into full-blown storms. Loyalties would be questioned, trust would be shattered, and the very question of who deserved what, emotionally, morally, and financially, would force each member of the Reiner family to confront truths they had never imagined facing. It started like any other evening, or so it seemed. The Reiner household, a sprawling Los Angeles residence filled with memories of laughter, milestones, and family milestones, exuded the quiet calm of domestic life. Lights glimmered through windows, a subtle glow of normalcy, and yet beneath the surface, an ominous tension was brewing, unnoticed by the world outside. That night would shatter not only the family's sense of security, but also the perception of what safety, trust, and love truly meant. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were last seen alive in their home, the kind of space that had once been filled with warm conversation, the smell of Michelle's cooking, and the laughter of children. Friends who knew the couple spoke of evenings spent in quiet reflection, perhaps watching a film, discussing the day's events, or sharing private jokes that only a lifetime of partnership could sustain. In these ordinary moments lay extraordinary love and connection, a foundation that would soon be violently disrupted. By the time emergency services arrived, the house had transformed from a haven into a crime scene. The details of what was discovered were chilling. Rob and Michelle had suffered multiple sharp force injuries, a horror that shocked investigators, family members, and the public alike. There is a certain disbelief that accompanies the news of such violence in a private home, the very place where one should feel most safe. This disbelief was compounded by the identity of the alleged perpetrator, Nick Reiner, the couple's own son. The thought alone is almost impossible to reconcile. A child who once ran through these halls, played in the backyard, and shared meals with his parents, now accused of a crime so unthinkable. When police first entered the home, they were faced with the grim reality of the situation. Investigators meticulously documented every detail, every trace of evidence, every potential clue. Forensic experts noted the severity of the injuries, the methodical nature of the attack, and the disturbing implications that the perpetrator must have had intimate knowledge of the home's layout, routines, and vulnerabilities. Each discovery added to the growing sense of horror and disbelief. This was not a random act of violence. This was personal. This was familial. The immediate aftermath of the tragedy was a mix of shock, grief, and confusion. Jake, Romy, and Tracy were informed, each in separate moments that would forever linger in their memories. Friends described Jake as initially numb, the kind of shock that makes reality feel distant, unreal, almost dreamlike. Romy, grappling with disbelief and horror, struggled to process the news while maintaining composure in front of others. Tracy, whose bond with Rob was both intimate and enduring, faced a profound mixture of sorrow, disbelief, and the instinct to protect her family from further harm. And then there was Nick. The narrative of that night shifted dramatically when law enforcement identified him as a suspect. Arrest protocols were swift and deliberate, ensuring that due process was followed even amidst the chaos of public scrutiny. Nick, who had once been a son laughing alongside his parents, now faced the cold machinery of the justice system. The accusations were grave: 2 counts of first-degree murder, each carrying the possibility of life imprisonment without parole or even the death penalty under California law. The transformation from beloved son to accused murderer was instantaneous, jarring, and almost surreal. Public reaction was immediate and intense. News outlets, social media platforms, and Hollywood circles exploded with speculation, grief, and outrage. The story became more than a familial tragedy. It was a cultural event, a shocking narrative of wealth, fame, and betrayal that captivated the nation. Friends, colleagues, and fans struggled to reconcile the image of the Reiners they knew, generous, accomplished, and deeply human, with the shocking news that one of their own stood accused of the unthinkable. Forensic and legal experts began to analyze the case, explaining the nuances of evidence, procedure, and motive. Public curiosity was insatiable. How could this happen? Why would a son turn on his parents? Could anyone truly understand the psychological undercurrents that led to such violence? Experts warned against oversimplifying the situation, emphasizing that family dynamics, psychological stress, and external pressures often converge in ways that defy easy explanation. Yet the public was drawn to the story not only for the sensational elements, but also for the uncomfortable questions it raised about trust, loyalty, and morality. The investigation unfolded in real time, and each revelation added layers to the tragedy. Security footage, witness statements, and forensic analysis slowly constructed a timeline that horrified even seasoned detectives. Each detail, the time of death, the nature of the injuries, the location of evidence, painted a picture of a night filled with chaos, fear, and deliberate action. The stark contrast between the life the Reiners had built and the violence of that evening created a narrative tension that gripped not only their immediate circle, but the entire nation. Meanwhile, the family had to grapple with an almost unimaginable duality, mourning their loss while confronting the allegations against their son. This duality is emotionally torturous, a conflict of love and revulsion, grief and incredulity. Each sibling was forced to navigate these conflicting emotions, balancing the desire for justice with the instinct to protect the family's legacy, all while being under the intense scrutiny of media, friends, and public opinion. The legal implications were immediate. Arrest procedures, arraignment scheduling, and the involvement of high-profile attorneys signaled the beginning of a long, complex process that would intertwine criminal law with family and inheritance law. Nick's defense team, led by Alan Jackson, faced the daunting task of defending a client whose alleged crime was so severe and publicized that conventional strategies could be insufficient. Meanwhile, legal experts and commentators began to speculate about the fate of the Reiner estate, raising questions about inheritance rights, trust clauses, and the applicability of the Slayer statute. This tragedy was not just a legal case. It was a human story, a study in extremes. It juxtaposed immense love with unimaginable betrayal, public admiration with private horror, and wealth with vulnerability. The night of the murders would forever define the Reiner family's narrative, transforming them from a symbol of Hollywood success into a cautionary tale about the fragility of familial bonds, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the profound consequences of actions taken in moments of extreme emotion or calculation. Even as investigators continued their work, and Nick faced charges that could define the rest of his life, one question remained at the center of the story. How would this tragedy affect the family's wealth, legacy, and trust? The answer would require navigating complex legal frameworks, confronting moral dilemmas, and facing public scrutiny in ways that no family could have anticipated. And as the night drew to a close, though its consequences would last for years, the Reiner family, their friends, and the public were left with a chilling reality: nothing would ever be the same. The bonds that had once seemed unbreakable were now strained to their limits, and every decision, every word, every action would carry weighty consequences. When law enforcement confirmed Nick Reiner as the primary suspect in the murders of his parents, the world recoiled. The shift was instantaneous. One moment, he was a son, a sibling, a member of a respected Hollywood family. The next, he was the accused, facing some of the gravest criminal charges imaginable. The psychological shock for the family alone was staggering, compounded by the immediate legal ramifications that would dominate the next chapter of their lives. Nick's arrest was methodical but emotionally charged. Authorities approached with precision, aware of the potential for public spectacle and the media frenzy that had already enveloped the case. For Nick, the transition from private citizen to defendant was abrupt and surreal. The handcuffs, the reading of Miranda rights, the escort to a patrol car. These were images that would flood the press, framing a narrative of guilt in the public mind even before the trial began. It is a chilling reality. The legal process, meant to ensure justice, also serves as a stage for public judgment, particularly in cases of high-profile individuals. The charges leveled against Nick were severe. 2 counts of first-degree murder carried potential consequences that include life imprisonment without the possibility of parole or even the death penalty, according to California law. The gravity of these charges cannot be overstated. First-degree murder requires intent, premeditation, and planning, a stark contrast to accidental or impulsive acts of violence. To be charged at this level is to face the full weight of the criminal justice system, including rigorous investigation, forensic scrutiny, and a trial that would leave no detail unexamined. For Jake, Romy, and Tracy, the moment of learning about Nick's arrest was a psychological and emotional rupture. The feeling of disbelief that one of their own could commit such a violent act collided with grief for the parents they had lost. Their minds struggled to reconcile 2 conflicting realities: the loving, familiar presence of their brother and the horrifying allegations now tied to him. Friends described Jake as initially frozen, a state of emotional shock that made comprehension nearly impossible. Romy grappled with a whirlwind of emotions, from sorrow to anger, attempting to process the implications while maintaining composure in front of the world. Tracy, deeply connected to Rob, had to balance her grief with her role as an observer of complex family dynamics, knowing her words and actions would carry weight in both legal and emotional spheres. The legal system immediately set into motion the processes that would determine Nick's future. Arraignment dates were scheduled, legal representation was secured, and the case began to unfold in a labyrinth of procedural complexity. Alan Jackson, a high-profile defense attorney, was retained to represent Nick. Jackson faced an uphill battle, defending a client whose alleged crime was not only heinous but also deeply publicized. Every aspect of the case, forensic evidence, witness testimony, familial testimony, would be scrutinized, dissected, and challenged in court. The stakes were monumental, not just for Nick, but for the family as a whole. Public reaction intensified as the news of the arrest spread. Social media erupted with speculation, judgment, and debate. Headlines highlighted the contradiction between the image of a beloved Hollywood family and the alleged actions of the son at the center of the storm. Friends, fans, and industry colleagues struggled to reconcile the persona they knew with the accusations now dominating headlines. It became clear that the case would not be contained within the walls of a courtroom. it would unfold on a national stage, subject to public opinion, bias, and sensationalism. The arrest also cast a harsh spotlight on family dynamics and inheritance concerns. Nick, as the potential heir to a multi-million-dollar estate, now faced questions that extended beyond criminal liability. Could he inherit from the estate if convicted? How would the trust, the will, and the designated trustees respond? Legal experts immediately began analyzing the implications, citing the Slayer statute, a law preventing anyone convicted of murdering the decedent from benefiting financially from the estate. Its application in this context was straightforward legally, but morally and emotionally, it was anything but simple. Sean Weisbart, an estate and trust attorney not connected to the Reiner family, provided context. Trustees are typically responsible for navigating these murky waters. The trustees are going to have to make decisions based not only on the law but on morality and public perception, Weisbart explained. Nick Reiner is accused of a very serious crime that would deprive him of inheritance. Trustees will likely take a conservative approach to protect the estate, meaning he could be blocked from receiving anything, regardless of his legal outcome in the criminal case. The stakes were clear. This was not just a criminal matter, but a family and financial crisis intertwined with morality, law, and public scrutiny. In the immediate aftermath, Nick remained behind bars. His detention symbolized both legal accountability and the broader uncertainty surrounding his fate. The arraignment, scheduled for January, would begin a legal journey fraught with challenges, public pressure, and the emotional weight of a family trying to reconcile love, grief, and the desire for justice. Each court appearance would be dissected by media outlets, analyzed for clues to his character, and serve as a focal point for ongoing public speculation. Friends and family wrestled with private emotions while navigating the public eye. The reality of loss collided with the accusations against their own brother, creating an unprecedented emotional landscape. How does one mourn the parents they loved while confronting the potential culpability of their sibling? How does one navigate trust, loyalty, and morality when legal definitions of guilt and innocence may not align with emotional truths? These questions would haunt the Reiner family as they moved forward, each step shadowed by grief and uncertainty. Even as the legal machinery began to turn, the broader implications of the case became increasingly clear. Public fascination with the story intertwined with serious ethical considerations. Nick's potential inheritance, the responsibilities of the trustees, the preservation of family legacy, all became central to the narrative. The line between justice and morality, law and emotion, personal grief and public scrutiny blurred in ways that would define not only the family's story, but also public perception of justice in high-profile cases. And as the legal and emotional threads began to weave together, one persistent, haunting question remained. Could Nick Reiner ever reclaim a sense of normalcy, or even a fraction of the inheritance he once stood to receive? The answers were hidden behind layers of legal complexity, trust agreements, and moral judgment. And what came next would make it painfully clear that the road ahead was fraught with obstacles no one had anticipated. Imagine this: a son, poised to inherit tens of millions from the parents who raised him, stands accused of their murder. It's a scenario so extreme that it feels like fiction, yet the law has a mechanism precisely for this nightmare: the Slayer statute. At first glance, it seems simple, almost obvious. No one should profit from their own crime. But as we peel back the layers, the statute reveals a tangle of legal nuance, family dynamics, and moral questions that are far from straightforward. The Slayer statute exists in most states, including California, where the Reiners lived. Its core principle is clear. A person who intentionally kills the decedent cannot inherit from them. It's a legal firewall designed to prevent the grotesque scenario of a murderer benefiting from their victim's estate. But simple as it sounds, its application in real life involves complex questions. What constitutes intentional killing? How is inheritance blocked? Immediately, or only after conviction? And crucially, what happens to the rest of the family, who may be collateral victims of the killer's actions? California's law is particularly explicit. A conviction of murder automatically triggers the statute. The accused is legally disqualified from receiving any portion of the estate. Even before trial, Many trusts and wills include provisions that give trustees discretion to withhold inheritance if a beneficiary is under criminal investigation for a serious offense. This adds another layer of complexity to the Reiner case. Nick Reiner, accused of first-degree murder, faces potential exclusion from the estate even before a court declares guilt. The trustees, responsible for managing Rob and Michelle Reiner's estate, have the authority and the moral imperative to act cautiously. Trust law complicates matters further. Many high-net-worth families, particularly in Hollywood, use revocable trusts to manage estates. A revocable trust allows assets to be controlled and distributed according to the decedent's wishes, while also providing mechanisms to handle unforeseen circumstances, including criminal accusations against beneficiaries. In the Reiner's case, the trust likely names trustees with discretion to manage the estate in a manner that preserves both the assets and the integrity of the family legacy. These trustees could be siblings, legal professionals, or family confidants. Individuals tasked with balancing fiduciary responsibility with moral judgment. Sean Weisbart, an estate attorney not connected to the Reiners, emphasizes the moral dimension. Trustees are placed in an incredibly difficult position. They have to protect the estate, honor the decedent's intentions, and make judgments about beneficiaries who may be accused of very serious crimes. In practice, that often means acting conservatively, which usually results in the accused beneficiary receiving nothing until the legal matter is resolved, if ever. The intersection of law and morality here is profound. Trustees are not merely administrators. They are gatekeepers, deciding who is worthy of inheritance and who is not. The statute also raises questions about timing. Does exclusion from inheritance happen automatically upon accusation, or only after conviction? In California, the law can operate in both ways. While a criminal conviction provides definitive grounds to block inheritance, trustees often act preemptively to prevent any assets from being misused. This preemptive action is not just legal prudence. It's also a protective measure to shield the estate from controversy and ensure the decedent's intentions are honored. For the Reiners, this could mean that Nick Reiner, even if not yet convicted, would be barred from accessing the family fortune until the courts determine his guilt or innocence. There's also a psychological dimension to consider. Families are not legal abstractions. Trustees, especially if they are family members, must weigh emotion against legality. In the Reiner case, siblings Jake, Romy, and Tracy could be named as trustees or beneficiaries with influence over estate decisions. How do you balance love and loyalty with the moral imperative to deny access to someone accused of murdering their parents? The law sets boundaries, but human emotion complicates every decision. Every dollar withheld, every trust decision, carries not just legal weight, but emotional and relational consequences. Historical precedents illustrate the stakes. In previous cases involving wealthy estates and accused heirs, trustees often had to act decisively, freezing assets and restructuring distributions. Legal challenges frequently followed, some extending for years. The presence of high-profile attorneys only intensified the scrutiny. In Hollywood and other elite circles, where estates often include complex investments, intellectual property, and international assets, managing inheritance under the Slayer statute becomes a multi-layered legal chess game. One wrong move could invite litigation, public scandal, or the perception of favoritism or bias. Public fascination with the Reiner case hinges not just on the alleged crime, but on this very legal complexity. The Slayer statute is more than an abstract principle. It's a force that determines the fate of millions of dollars, the balance of familial power, and the moral judgment of society. Every step in the legal process, from trustees' decisions to court rulings, carries the potential for dramatic revelation, tension, and even scandal. Audiences are drawn to this intersection of wealth, crime, and morality because it magnifies what happens when family, law, and human behavior collide. But even as the statute provides a legal framework, ambiguity remains. What if the accused is acquitted? Could assets be retroactively distributed? What if the accused never has access, yet the family dynamics are permanently altered? In practice, the law interacts with human behavior, creating situations where legal, financial, and emotional consequences intersect unpredictably. For the Reiners, the Slayer statute is more than a law. It's the lens through which the family's tragedy, grief, and potential resolution will be filtered. This legal reality sets the stage for the next chapter. The reading of the will by Billy Crystal, a friend of decades, whose presence symbolizes both loyalty and the emotional gravity of the moment. As the trustees prepare to interpret Rob and Michelle Reiner's intentions, the intersection of law, family loyalty, and moral judgment comes into sharp focus. Every word read, every clause referenced, and every decision about asset distribution will reflect not only the law but the deep complexities of familial bonds strained by tragedy. And as the family braces for the revelation of the will, one question remains: how far does the law protect the legacy of the deceased, and how far can human emotion interfere with justice? The answers lie in the details to come, and no one is prepared for what is about to unfold. But what came next would bring the private legal drama into a public spectacle, exposing conflicts, surprises, and decisions that would leave everyone in the room stunned, and no one saw it coming. The day of the will reading was heavy with tension. The Reiner family, still reeling from grief, assembled in the familiar yet now haunted space of their Los Angeles home. It was a room that had once echoed with laughter, debate, and familial warmth. Now, it carried the weight of absence, of loss, and of anticipation. At the center of it all was Billy Crystal, longtime friend of Rob Reiner, chosen to read the will, a role that was both ceremonial and profoundly emotional. Crystal, known for his humor and charm, faced the delicate task of balancing clarity, empathy, and the intense scrutiny of everyone present. From the outset, the atmosphere was electric, a charged mix of expectation, fear, and unresolved emotion. Jake sat stiffly, attempting to maintain composure, though his eyes betrayed a storm of conflicting feelings: sorrow for the parents he had lost, anger at the circumstances, and anxiety about what the reading might reveal. Romy's fingers clutched a folded piece of paper, her knuckles white, as she braced for whatever revelations lay ahead. Tracy, whose presence added a layer of historical perspective, maintained a measured calm, but even she could not fully shield herself from the emotional gravity of the moment. Nick, still in custody but present for the reading under court supervision, was a figure of tension. His expression was unreadable, a mix of defiance, fear, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the legal and moral storm surrounding him. The accusations against him loomed over every word, every pause, every clause of the will. Family members, trustees, and Crystal himself were acutely aware that each line read would carry weight not just in financial terms, but in the emotional and moral fabric of the family. Billy Crystal began with a voice that blended solemnity and respect. The opening words acknowledged the gravity of the moment. A celebration of Rob and Michelle's lives, their achievements, and their love for their children. Then came the transition to the legal content, the clauses, bequests, and trust directives that would determine the distribution of a vast and complex estate. Every eye in the room followed him, every ear attuned to the cadence of his voice, as the intentions of the deceased were revealed. The will itself was structured with care, reflecting decades of thought and meticulous planning. Trusts were already in place, detailing not only the distribution of wealth, but also contingencies for unforeseen circumstances. It was here that the Slayer statute intersected with human emotion in real time. Crystal, navigating the legal language with precision, reached the clauses that addressed potential disinheritance for criminal acts against the decedents. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jake and Romy exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. The acknowledgement of Nick's legal predicament, already public knowledge, was now formally reflected in the language of the will. Trustees were explicitly granted authority to withhold assets from any beneficiary whose actions violated moral or legal obligations. It was a clause designed to protect the estate, honor the intentions of the deceased, and prevent the grotesque scenario of a murderer profiting from his crime. The emotional impact was profound. The legal framework now collided with the intimate reality of family betrayal. Crystal's reading was punctuated by pauses, moments where emotion threatened to overtake protocol. He spoke with measured clarity, yet the weight of the words, bequests redirected, discretionary powers granted, contingencies activated, resonated far beyond the legal framework. The siblings felt a complex mix of relief, guilt, and lingering grief. Relief that the estate would be protected, guilt over the necessity of denying a sibling, grief that the family had come to this moment at all. Tracy, observing the reading, noted the care taken in the wording. The will was not punitive, it was protective. It sought to preserve the legacy of Rob and Michelle, to safeguard their intentions, and to navigate the legal and moral complications introduced by Nick's charges. Yet the clarity of the clauses could not erase the emotional turmoil. Every directive, no matter how legally precise, was a reminder of loss, betrayal, and the fragile nature of trust. As Crystal concluded the reading, the room was heavy with a silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. No one spoke, yet the weight of comprehension settled over everyone like a physical presence. The will had done its job legally, but emotionally, the room was a battlefield of grief, anger, and unresolved questions. The legal framework was clear, but the human consequences were complex and unresolved. The reading also revealed subtle surprises, discretionary powers that allowed trustees to make judgments in real time, provisions for charitable donations reflecting Rob and Michelle's philanthropic priorities, and clauses that preserved certain assets for the benefit of all siblings except in cases of criminal disqualification. These details, while technical, had profound emotional and practical implications. Every decision that would follow, asset allocation, trustee actions, potential legal challenges, would be guided by these carefully crafted directives. The atmosphere was fraught with tension as Crystal closed the folder. The legal framework of the will was now clear, but questions lingered. How would the trustees exercise their discretion? How would the family navigate the moral and emotional complexities of enforcing disinheritance against a sibling? How would Nick respond, legally, emotionally, and publicly, to the realization that even if acquitted, the road to accessing the estate would be fraught with hurdles? And as the family processed the reading, a new layer of tension emerged. The world was watching.